Of course, none of this would be possible without our excellent sponsors for our UX at Scale conference. And our top sponsor is Atlassian Design. And if you joined Monday's webinar, or Tuesday's webinar, you got to take a peek inside of their design process. They are actually hiring for design roles in Mountain View as well as Sydney. And their design team is focused on building powerful experiences for Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, and all Atlassian products. So they have almost 200 folks on their design team now. And it's a very mature design organization. So if you're curious about that, feel free to check it out. And of course, our other gold sponsor is Salesforce. And they have a fantastic Medium publication, which has a lot of advice around designing at scale in the enterprise. Definitely worth checking out. And of course, if this is your first time encountering us, we are UXPin. We are a full stack UX design platform. So we support prototyping, design systems, developer documentation, and developer handoffs all in one place. And if you'd like to learn more, you can head on over to our website, and we do offer a free trial as well. And with that being said, I will pass this over to Erin now.
Hey everybody, I'm Erin Powers. So I'm going to talk today about predicting the value of user experience using standard financial models. Before we get too fast into this, I wanted to give a big thank you to a bunch of the organizations that have supported this work, currently supported by Athena Health, where I work now. Some of the research was done at Carnegie Mellon University, Babson, and MathWorks. Of course, again, thanks again to our conference sponsors, Atlassian, Salesforce, and UXPin, and to Jerry for setting this all up. Thank you, Jerry. So what we're going to talk about today is bridging the gap, essentially, between user experience and financial metrics. What I hope is that you'll learn some techniques to predict the UX value of work, or the value of UX in terms of dollars, before you do that user experience. Starting from the basics, what can user experience improve about the business? There's three things that we hear about. Increasing sales is probably the most important thing. UX can increase sales if you have more people purchasing the product, or in a couple other ways. Could be reducing costs by, say, reducing tech support calls, or could be just generally increasing customer productivity and happiness. Now, what UX improves about your business may differ. So every company is a little bit different in the way that you might apply this to yourself. Could go through a different path to get there. This presentation, I'm going to focus on increasing sales. A quote from Eugenie Burtis and Mark Burtis about this. They say that UX professionals are called upon to take businesses with an interest in reaching broader audiences and make those businesses accessible to every segment of the market, or more segments of the market. That's one way that you could increase have UX increase the business value or increase sales. That's really essentially learnability. If you lower the learning curve, more users can use the product that you're doing, and therefore your market has increased, and that could increase sales. There's a couple other ways. If you have a well-established product, maybe market saturation or additional products that you want to sell, transfer to other products might be the key value for you in terms of your customers. If they like the product that you have, they might want to buy more things from you. Other way is recommendations to others. Essentially, if they have a great experience using the products that you're building, then they say great things about those products to other people, and those people will start saying, use it, potentially become customers of yours, expanding your product by word of mouth. And the last way is renewals or retention or reducing attrition, any way to keep those customers that you have continuing to come and not leaving. You've probably heard about the term return on investment. It's a pretty simple looking calculation when you first look at it. It's just three numbers, or actually two numbers, one twice. Gain from investment minus the cost of investment divided by the cost of investment. So but once you try to implement this, you may find it to be a bit interesting. So first of all, the things that you might get out of this, you might get an answer like the result could be the ROI of UX is 10%. Sounds like a bond return. I wish I had a bond return that was sent, but the idea is that there's a return that's comparable to other investments, like should you invest in UX, should you invest in bonds, invest in development. We're going to talk a little bit about ROI at the end of this presentation, but there's also on your own. Challenges that people have run into include the need to financially separate the gain from UX compared to the gain from all the other efforts and all the development that you put into it. So for example, there's a lot of companies that make 3 times a year. If you're doing that, it could be hard to say, this is the value of this one feature versus this is the value of other features. Companies that are doing A/B tests like Amazon is known to do and can isolate the costs.
Hey, Erin, sorry to interrupt here. Folks are mentioning that they experienced some choppiness in the audio. Are you dialed in through the phone or are you plugged in through the computer?
No, I'm plugged in through the computer. We actually don't have a phone in this room.
I see. Okay, let me see.
Is this cutting out for you too, Jerry?
Yeah, I'm hearing a little bit of chop there.
Oh, sorry to hear that. I don't know if there's anything I can change on my end, unfortunately.
Okay, let me see here.
Without going to the speakerphone that we tried last time that had really bad audio quality.
Yeah, maybe what we can do is maybe if you, let's see, I don't know if you have are you able to dial in with your cell phone?
Unfortunately, I have no cell phone reception in here.
I see. Okay, no worries. Maybe what we can do then is maybe if speaking slower could help. I think maybe I think sometimes when the pace quickens, it gets a little choppy.
Yep. Okay, I can try that. I'm going to keep my eyes on that chat panel too a little bit. So sounds like a couple people are getting relatively good audio quality at the moment. So yep, try to talk a little bit slower. Remind me if you start hearing any choppiness coming up. So the other challenge that you can have when you try to apply using ROI, good, is that you can want to make sure that your estimates are perceived as being unbiased. And there's a lot of different, in order to actually separate those different things and pick the right metrics to go into ROI, sometimes people find that maybe the ROI metric doesn't resonate as well because it's hard to believe that it applies in general, or that the UX person didn't necessarily just pick and choose numbers. So what I'm going to talk about is some techniques that will help you not just apply these kinds of calculations, but also make sure that it's effective in terms of being able to share it with your organization. Great. One book that I want to mention here is Cost Justifying Usability. This book will go into the ROI calculation and types of ROI in far more depth than I will here. If you're interested in it, it's an excellent book to pick up. Lots of different examples. So I'm going to talk about 2 different methods that calculate benefits in slightly different ways. The second method is going to end with an ROI calculation, but the first method is going to be basically a decision tree and modeling that. And I see a question about the name of the book. The name of the book is Cost Justifying Usability. So you can use these models in a couple different ways. Some of you may be able to take this straight out and be able to really be interested in diving straight into using these directly. I found that just as many people as I talk to find this really good for us as a thinking framework. If you can use some of these terms and these techniques and think about how UX fits into the business and start talking about it that way, you can often have much more productive discussions about how UX works, even without applying these models directly and crunching all the numbers. So the concepts are drawn from a couple diverse fields that we'll talk about. Key one is, of course, finance. There's some textbook financial models that we'll pull in here, particularly Proformas. Decision models are techniques for simulating and managing understanding decisions, guiding decision making, essentially. Marketing analytics is particularly interesting because it has a lot of similarities with user experience. The goal at the end of increasing sales or changing the perception, how people perceive the product and changing sales is very similar. And both marketing analytics and user experience are focused on user behavior. The difference is that in UX, typically we're interested in changing the product, whereas In marketing, maybe they're more interested in advertising or some other intervention, but then the models from that point become fairly similar. You can get a lot to learn from that. Machine learning is also a field for this. Particularly regression modeling is a real Swiss Army knife. When you have different variables here, such as user experience metrics and business metrics, regression modeling can help you cut through the noise, particularly when there's a lot of different variables in play. Okay, so the first method we have is called a decision tree. And the scenario that we're going to talk through is about early user research. So imagine it's a company, say Acme company, and we'll start with a very simple scenario just to prove the point here. Let's say it's a company that's investing in a brand new product, and the question that you're trying to figure out is, should we invest in UX or not, and UX research, usability research, before we build the product? So this is basic decision tree. On the left side, it starts with just the name of the tree, in this case, Acme Development First Tree. And the first block kind of goes left to right that you'll see. The green box right here is essentially a decision point. And so the decision that we're going to start with right now is, do you develop a product or you don't develop a product? So it's always makes sense in these to add kind of a null decision point. Compare yourself to doing nothing. In this case, doing nothing costs you $0, but on the other hand, you gain nothing out of it. There's going to be no market response. Nobody's going to give you any money. So the second branch that you'll look at is development costs. So for this scenario, you can imagine that the product costs about $7 million to develop. That's the estimate. We haven't built this product yet. This tree, this whole model, by the way, is built in Palisades decision tree. There are a bunch of different decision tree softwares out there that will help you build this. You don't have to do all the math yourself, but you do want to understand kind of how it fits together, be able to plug things in. Now imagine the next thing after you develop a product, what would happen is that you release the product and there will be a market response. The market's going to respond in different ways. And what we're going to do is essentially model the probability that the market is going to respond well, fair, or awfully to the techniques. So the thing here is we never know how people are going to respond to this product. If you're a marketing team, will certainly know and have some feeling that we're pretty confident if we're talking about building this, that there's going to be a good market response. But there's certainly still chances that it could be a flop for many different reasons, some that are uncontrolled by the company. But your marketing team here can help you fill in these numbers. And in fact, I really recommend that you work with finance and marketing product owners to pick these numbers rather than trying to pick these numbers yourself. Have them stand behind the probabilities and the market responses. The idea of if you had a great result, maybe you think you'd make $11 million on the product, and there's a 45% chance of that. In this scenario, the next thing that happens after gaining revenue, essentially on the far right side, what we do is we calculate just the final value that the product gets in this particular branch. So in this case, $11 million in revenue minus $7 in costs equals $4 million total value. So those three branches give you some ability to kind of model these different responses of the market, but we got to combine those together and use them. And the way you do this is with expected value. I love the Wikipedia definition of this. It's simple and clear. The expected value is the weighted average of the values. And the value may not be expected in this ordinary sense that you're thinking about. It may be unlikely or even impossible, such as having 2.5 children. We might expect to have 2.5 children, but no one actually has that number. So in this example, we're going to take those numbers on the right side and essentially weight them, those probabilities that you're seeing right there by the numbers below them. So 45% chance times 4 million for the great results, 20% chance times 6 million for the terrible results. The expected value for this investment is about 250K when you put together all three of those things. So this expected value, then you plot it on this decision tree. So you say that the entire value of this red node probability is $250,000. If you get there, that's the best guess that you can make in terms of what the market is going to respond. And then the decision tree does something for you. It's going to recommend a decision and essentially simulate the results. It sees that $250,000 is better than zero, kind of obvious, but then it's going to recommend and mark it essentially as true and say that you would always take that, any rational person would take the $250,000 market risk here rather than doing nothing. Because there's a chance of a decent return on investment here. So that actually gets plugged that essentially that branch gets pulled up to the next level, and the next level takes the value. The overall value you can gain here is that same $250,000. Okay, so we're going to simplify this a little bit. Actually, that whole 250,000 market results, I'm compressing down into one chunk. And let's going to start adding in the information about user research and how we model user research in here. So what happens, original question, if we include user research upfront before we develop the product and use that to understand and adjust to the risk better? So there's really two benefits you can get from doing a usability study before you develop the product. The first benefit is better estimation on whether the market response will be happy, great, neutral, or awful. So in this scenario, with this benefit, essentially what you're getting is very similar to a market test. Every time you talk to customers, you get a little bit more information about how people are going to respond to your customers. And let's just say this, the only thing, the benefit that we're isolating right here is just the benefit of being able to know a little bit more about your customers and how they'll respond. Just imagine a basic test with 5 people. Maybe you have different responses. People will say different things, and you could use that to make a guess as to increasing your understanding or your probability of what the market response is. So there's actually going to be 3 different branches. If the market response is great, we're going to adjust those probabilities, say, shift them a little more towards the great responses. If you get an awful test in your usability test, you're going to shift those results down to the awful side a little bit more. And we can plug all of these into our decision tree and before we even run this test to see what is the value of this test if that's the benefit, the estimated benefit for it. So we'll take the model we had before. We're going to add a decision point here on whether to run a study. Again, do nothing or run a study to compare the two. So this tree gets a little bit bigger. Let's focus on the new section for a moment. That's basically the tree we were just showing before. The idea is that your decisions might be changing now based upon the results of this market test. Imagine in this example, it costs you $100,000 to run this usability test. You have your market results. Then there's trees. In the scenario where you have a great response, your probabilities are much better, so you're much more likely to develop. So you're more confident about that. In the fair case and the awful case, it turns out that just the way these probabilities worked, and you would of course adjust these for your own company, the best decision would not to be develop the product because it would be a losing proposition if most likely the result was even fair to awful, and you would pick a different product or something else to invest in. So you can actually, essentially what this now does is it pulls those probabilities up the chain to the point where the overall value of this branch, essentially of this decision, is gone up from $250,000 to $1.1 million, just because you can have a little bit more information up front and make a better decision on whether to release the product or not. Let's go into the second benefit. This is probably, for UX designers, a little bit more what you're thinking about in terms of usability tests. After usability test, you're going to change the product. So you're going to tune it. So if you get, you're going to make it better no matter what you get, and tune the product and make it more likely for those let's just say the fair response to become a good response. So we can change that response by changing market response by changing the product early enough in the process by doing that usability test early on. So the way that we model this is essentially changing that one branch of the tree, that branch that was sort of the fair, medium response, to the point where, let's say we redesign the product and our expected value goes up over the course of this. And so your test result is now $1.4 million for the overall value of this branch, because in this case, when you would previously have gotten a poor response, you would have just dropped the product. Now you're going to develop it, but develop a better product than you would have been able to. So the next question is really, how much should we spend on running this kind of study? What's this study worth? One way to think about this is expected value of sample information, mouthful there. That's actually a pretty simple equation. It's the value of doing the test, if the test were free, minus the value without the test. So in other words, the new value of that tree, if the usability tests were free, minus the value that you had before, which is that original $250,000. So in this scenario, what you would do is essentially pay up to around $1 million for these two benefits. And note that we were able to do this based upon some models and guessing and agreement with marketing team, financial team to just understand and manage probability and put a usability test at a time where it can really influence and potentially change the product to make it more, help the market react to it better. I'm going to pause for just a second and see, do we have any questions so far for this section? I know we'll also stop at the end, so it's okay if we don't have any questions yet.
So somebody just had a real quick question actually around how do you decide the percentages that are assigned to each decision in the decision tree?
Excellent question. If you're a UX person, I would recommend that you don't try to do that yourself. I would recommend that you work with particularly a marketing analyst, your product owner, someone who's on the business side that's maybe already making these kinds of estimates, and ask them to assign those values to this tree. And so work within the framework that they'll give you, and that will also increase their confidence that what you're doing is not made up. So one thing you want to really make sure you avoid when you're using these kinds of financial metrics is any sense that you are pulling numbers from your own, from midair, basically. And anytime that you can say, this number was picked for me by the expert who you trust, your senior leaders trust over in this area in finance. Whenever I've been able to do that, I've found that very quickly people come on board and I say, oh, that's Bob's information? Okay, great. Now we trust that. Bob knows everything about finance. That's the best guess we're going to get. Okay?
Great. Yep. So, yep, that was the only question there.
Yep. I see a second question, and I'm actually going to cover this in that just came in about more literature and more sources for this kind of thing. There are a couple good sources that will help you, I think, understand the overall things of how this fits in that I'm going to recommend in this second method. The second method is really about modeling how investments influence business results. And what we're going to do here is model the value of organization-wide investments in UX. You could model investments in smaller topics too, but the scenario that we're going to walk through is that one. This is based upon research from Len Schlesinger, Jeff Sorrow, and Jim Lewis. We've talked to a couple of these guys, Len and Jim, so far to get some pieces of information that we pulled into this presentation. You'll find a lot of information in terms of how, from Len from the business side and how you connect the whole process. I'll show you a screenshot of his, and a lot of information from Jeff Sorrow and Jim Lewis in terms of how to measure usability and some of the connections that we'll actually use later in this presentation. The way that we're going to do this is really it's about a three-stage process. First, we're going to start with modeling the factors that influence revenue for your company using regression and mediation analysis. We're going to model the influencers, what influences what influences the investment through to the final product in terms of business metrics. And then we're going to calculate or predict the impact, essentially using financial pro formas to calculate this. So I find this particular this particular framework is from Len Schlesinger. It's actually 25 plus years old at this point. It's been used in a lot of different places. It's pretty comprehensive. You'll see a lot of models that fit into a small chunk of this. The idea here is that if you have satisfied or happy employees at your company, those companies are going to be more productive. They're going to create value for your company's customers. The customers will be more satisfied. Because they're more satisfied, they'll be more loyal to you, to your company. That will lead to revenue growth, profitability, and then there's this big loop coming all the way back. Because your company is more profitable, you can invest it back in the company, and then create this virtuous cycle essentially that creates this loop, which is supposed to feed on itself and help essentially keep growing the company in a great way. And the concept is that some of the best companies in the world are really good at all of these different stages and understand how they connect together in a way that lets them leverage this. And in terms of UX, you're probably really interested in the right half, the value of the product, the customer satisfaction, loyalty, and how that leads to revenue. And it's a couple of different stages there. One reason for pulling up, there's a great paper. This would be one piece of literature I'd recommend at least skimming to understand how these statistical relationships get pulled together. There are actually hundreds of studies that have used tested different links in the service profit chain, and this particular paper pulled together many of those to test them all, and they found links between all these different points, theoretical, and every business is a little bit different. So some companies, some industries found stronger links in some places and weaker links in others. There's a lot of need to kind of potentially customize these kinds of frameworks for your business before you can apply them really effectively. When you're trying to do this, it's important. I think it's typical that we might want to just go straight for the jugular in terms of start wherever we're starting and try to go straight to our goal. So in the basic scenario where, for example, our goal is higher graduation rates in schools, we might say that we want to model whether we have better teachers. Maybe you invest in them by hiring more teachers or hiring more expensive teachers or a million other ways, or giving them more resources so that the teachers can be more effective. But there's a missing piece in the middle. If you try to model straight from teachers to grades, you're not going to find as strong of a statistical relationship as if you pull the middle thing into teachers lead to better grades, and better grades will lead to higher graduation rates, and suddenly the models will probably come out a lot better. You'll be able to see a lot more details. You'll be much more likely to be able to establish that statistical link because you're following the whole path along this. And the basic theory behind this is, as you're trying to model this, peel away those layers of the onion between the business goals and the UX. Okay, so let's essentially model the effect of UX and adapt that model, service profit chain, to our uses. Starting on the left side, we're going to invest in user experience. We're going to start by improving the user experience. Our theory is that when customers experience that, they'll have a better perception of the product. Those better perceptions of the product will lead to more word of mouth, which leads to sales growth. This is a pretty basic model. Maybe your company isn't shooting for better word of mouth, and that's the way you're getting the sales growth. So there might be a couple different ways of getting there. You might be shooting for increased productivity and cost savings and renewal rates, or lower barriers to entry, et cetera. So I'm going to focus really out. There are many different ways you might customize this tree based upon your business's goals and how they plan to get there, but let's focus on just one of them. This one's I think the most common one that I've seen. Improved user experience leads to better perceptions of the product, which leads to better word of mouth, which leads to sales growth. There are popular metrics measuring each of these. There are also plenty of custom metrics, and I recommend that if you do this, try to figure out what the right metrics are for you and your business at each of these stages, rather than just going straight out and picking one of the most popular metrics. But talk through those because you may have heard of some of these. The investment in user experience might be a dollar value, which is how you're measuring the improved user experience, or at least the investment in it. The system usability scale is a pretty common scale for measuring usability. Net promoter score is very common for measuring word of mouth, and sales growth is common for, well, sales growth is sales growth. The best part of this is none of these links that I'm showing here, none of these metrics and none of these links are new. Every step has been done before, pretty well established and by many different people trying these kinds of things. So let's start by looking briefly at the higher system usability scale. You'll measure usability with SUS or SuperQ or another survey scale that measures the perceptions of what your customers think of the user interface. There's a lot of data. One reason I like SUS is because Jeff Soro and Jim Lewis have built averages and scales from hundreds of studies. There's databases here, and they know that the average across industries is 60. There's some information that individual industries might have for a SUS score. Having a benchmark will help you compare yourself and your product to somewhere else and help you kind of pick a goal too. The next step is SUS's link to the Net Promoter Score. So Net Promoter Score is the most popular of these metrics for word of mouth. There are actually many others, and we at Athena have actually had an opportunity to do some tests comparing Net Promoter Score to what actually is called likelihood to recommend, is the raw scale, if you just average your numbers, versus a little bit of a calculation that the way this textbook will recommend it. But the main idea here is that you're asking your customers how likely, what they will say about the product. And you're trying to get them to say, the goal is that UX investments will increase how many good things or what good things they say about the product to other people, or increase other people's perceptions of the product. There's a relationship between SUS and NPS, particularly the LTR, or likelihood to recommend, that average score that we found to be particularly effective, more effective than the raw NPS, is something you can calculate, you can estimate it from SUS, more likely to be good for you to gather this data from your customers through surveys or measuring it in some way. The next link that we have is essentially links between the word of mouth scores or net promoter scores and sales growth. There are a ton of different metrics here. You'll find papers out here that compare pros and cons of all these different metrics. NPS has been hotly debated. There are some strengths to it. There are some weaknesses. It works for some companies and doesn't work for others. And it works for them in different ways. But you'll probably be able to find, you can find 10 of these different metrics like NPS that are, every one of them has done some sort of studies to compare themselves to sales growth and has shown some statistical link, because in general, the concept, it just shares that concept that if people are saying that they'll say good things about your product, that's a really good sign that more people are going to be hearing good things about your product and linking it to sales growth. So let's try and apply this a little bit and talk about how this might work for an average software company. The way I recommend getting some of these numbers is from a guy in the finance department. Don't try to guess these numbers. Again, go to your particular financial expert to get these kinds of information. You might not need everything that's on this list. Weighted average cost of capital is important. It's pretty important to know your current revenue when you're having these conversations, or how many years of revenue the company typically simulates, often 5 years. What you're growing, whether the company is growing or not, what your current growth rate is, maybe for a product, maybe for the company as a whole. And then other pieces of these may or may not be useful depending on how deep you want to go into this analysis and the pro forma simulation. If you want to actually pull this into the, try and apply this completely to how a company would work, what we'd look at is essentially a forecast for the next couple of years. And the idea here is that what we're doing in all measurements is going to change the forecast over the next few years. I've essentially crunched these numbers with average software company metrics that are public using a suite of numbers from different sources. You can plug in the numbers for your own company if you wanted to and try to do this. Essentially, we'll start with sort of growth rates and what an average software company looks like, put it into a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet looks like a lot. Don't try to read the small print. My point isn't that, for this slide, isn't that you should read the small print, but that we almost fit it on one slide. It's not actually that complicated to do all this. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. The important part is making sure that your numbers are the numbers that your whole company would agree to when you do these kinds of simulations. We're constantly using the Proforma approach when you hear a revenue forecast from a public company. That's the same technique that they're using. And they're maybe more sophisticated or less sophisticated, but the basic method is not too complicated. So we'll take those things and apply sort of industry averages to all of these. Let's try to apply this increased investment in user experience using some of these standard metrics. 3% of spending is a little bit of a more hand-wavy number than the other ones. Imagine that the average company is spending 3% of their spend on user experience, which leads to an average score in the SUS scale of 68, an average software product NPS of 15%, and an average sales growth of 14%. Now let's try applying that concept and using the equations that from all these public linkages to estimate what happens if you, say, triple your investment in spending. And if tripling the investment in your spending was enough to take you from an average SUS score of 68 to a basically best-in-class score of 80. 80 is at the high end. It's not the maximum score, but very few companies have higher than 80 SUS scores. And that might be, the goal might, in your case for your company, might just be to beat competitors, to be enough higher than competitors, depending upon what market that you're going for. That higher, using these linkages, that highest best-in-class SUS score is about a 20% net promoter score and about leads to about 19% sales growth. So to sum that up, increasing from the SUS from the average to the best is the potential to increase sales growth from 3 to 8% per year with some confidence intervals. Looking at the average, the financial return could be, using these kinds of numbers, the estimates 67% internal rate of return or 54% return on investment. Again, your company is really going to vary from these. This is just based upon those kinds of public numbers and information. So I hope that these slides and techniques have helped a little bit. Happy to open up the table for questions. I know we're asking about the presentation deck. Yes, we'll share that. Any other questions?
Great, thanks, Erin. That was extremely detailed, and yeah, great job. I'm going to go ahead and run a poll here, and we can go ahead and dive further into the questions here. So let me see here if anyone else. So someone was wondering if you have any example links to spreadsheets or anything of that sort.
I may be able, I think I can probably share that spreadsheet in the same place. I believe it's basically all public kinds of information. So yeah, that spreadsheet. I tend to with your financial team to use to work based upon their models rather than kind of trying to do this from scratch on your own. But if you want to use it to play and kind of learn how this might work, this could be really helpful.
Yeah. And the next question is, how often do you run these models in your average product or project lifecycle?
Are we asking about me personally or companies as a whole?
I think they're asking you personally, and then if you want, you could also mention for context as a whole as well.
Yes, I think for me, I've been running some of these models off and on for years. We are using these general approaches at Athena in order to help us understand where do we invest in UX and where are the best places to invest, and kind of take it one layer deeper, essentially, than just justifying questions, but figuring out what we do. So I've been doing these kinds of models for a while. I also do a number of other models that I think they all hold together to do this kind of work. Most of what I'm showing, though, is really pulled together from industry standards in a bunch of different places. I don't see these pulled together very often for UX, which is why I put this talk together. But if you talk to finance team and show them the chunk that applies to finance, they'll say, oh yeah, that I know about Proforma. Yeah, that we do that type of financial forecasting. And we're trying to see how we can, what type of investments we should make to do that. And it depends on which companies you go to and in terms of how much they use. But there are a lot of different techniques, places that use individual pieces of this puzzle and try to leverage that in one way or another with different models that you may see, simpler or more complex.
Right. And the next question is, how do you recommend modeling the ROI if your users are both internal and external? Is there any changes that you would make?
Yeah, I think the equation, I would probably try to model each of those two effects separately and then add them together at the end. So if you have customers that are internal, you're probably thinking more about increased productivity rather than word of mouth, for example. So you're going to take a different path to get there between UX and the business benefits. So you'll measure something different, measure ROI, or you probably don't care about sales growth from your internal customers because that's not something that their recommendations aren't going to change the product results. But when you look at the external customers, you're going to be looking at things like word of mouth, satisfaction with the product, things that lead them to keep using the product. The internal customers will have less choices, so you're not going to be as worried about them switching away. But essentially those two different separate benefits are additive, and you can really just model them separately and put them together.
Got it. The next question is, how do you usually present these results or models to the team? Is there any particular points that you try to emphasize?
Yeah, so I think that presentation for how you do this does make a big difference in terms of ability for the organization to kind of believe in this. One of the things that I focused on is starting on, when I had some of those charts, flow charts, which I will flip to real quickly, essentially these kinds of flow charts, I tend to, if I'm talking with business leaders, I start by trying to establish the links on the right side first for the company, because typically they don't, if you start by saying UX is going to go straight for, UX is going to influence sales growth and give them that number right at the beginning of the process, that might be hard to convince. And you got to make sure that you build consensus. Use the people who are your experts in your organization as much as you can. Share the results with them early and get their critique early, so that by the time that you're talking to the executives and saying, yeah, there's a link between Net Promoter Score and sales growth, and I've already checked it with Bob or John, Bob and John and Andre, all three of those guys have said, yes, yeah, that this technique works, and they've reviewed my work, then there's will be very little debate at that point in the conversation. Basically, I think the prep work that you're doing to get to that point is all to try to reduce the chance that someone's going to come back and say, I don't believe you because I think you're making something up, or I think that you're making the linkage in a way that may not reflect our business. So use the business as much as you can to help you make those kinds of decisions and get the presentation that will work for them. More questions?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So the next question is, how do you manage expectations around what people can reasonably expect after you show them this model? So for instance, if they expect, I don't know, 54% return, but only get 35% afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it probably depends upon whether or not, I think you want to set your expectations somewhere in the middle, because there are definitely a ton of limitations to this. And I think it's important to communicate that you know the limitations, you know that you're estimating things here, but that you have taken account for what everything that everyone knows. You've talked to everyone in the org and built their knowledge into these kinds of models. And I think it's often important to kind of tailor some of these things, and I find it, depending upon who you're talking to, you may want to ditch the statistical terms, or you may want to use the statistical terms and try to talk that way, either in simpler language if people are more receptive to simple stories, or use the statistical language to kind of couch your terms and say, well, there's a probability here, there's a confidence interval here. This is our goal is to change our users' perceptions, or the ratings of the perceptions. And if that happens, talk about ifs and thens, rather than saying in absolute terms, we know if you invest in UX, it will help this much. So I think controlling that knowledge and that communication, so that you can make sure that people understand there is a risk and they don't feel uncomfortable with that, can really help here.
Right. And someone said that many teams take ownership for improvements to the bottom line. So how do you determine how much of it is attributed to user experience versus, say, like marketing efforts, or just improvements in tool performance?
Oh yeah, so that's a really important question. There's a couple different ways for this. So one of them is that exact problem is one of the reasons why I don't use the ROI calculation as much as a day-to-day basis, even though we're talking about what we want as an end goal is ROI, because it's so hard to tease apart those investments. So this, my charts was, if I can find this one, kind of talking about essentially all these different effects. And if we put the arrows in a slightly different order, here we go. The thing that's going on here is there's actually a lot of different factors that contribute to sales growth. So in this model, you could imagine that all of these factors actually could lead to sales growth, or lead to a final dollar value at the end. Using if you're using surveys to measure at these 2 points, to measure people's perceptions of the product and how they plan to communicate about it, you can also measure different types of perceptions or different models and how they affect. So maybe all of these or all of them might lead to sales growth. So the nice thing about regression modeling and another technique that I didn't mention here, which is mediation analysis, which is built on regression modeling, is that when you have a pile of different variables, you can still, as long as your response variable at the end is 1, such as dollar value gained from all of these different places, you can model any number of variable impacts on that. Essentially, model the chain itself and make sure that the chain itself is statistically significant and start teasing apart those different factors. So I do find that it helps to broaden your survey when to the point where you're asking some of these questions that are outside of the user experience area. Maybe collaborate with marketing to pick the questions that are appropriate. Other teams that have questions that really apply to help you answer the questions and understand the different competing effects or different competing things across the chain.
Right.
Okay.
And do you have any suggestions on how to measure UX ROI below the product level? So, for instance, how can we measure improve UX for a specific feature, maybe for a specific user pain point?
Sure. And how you would use these techniques on one feature rather than on a whole product. Is that correct?
Yeah, someone is kind of wondering at a more micro level how these concepts may apply.
Yeah. I think any change to what there's a couple ways you can think about this. The first way is just imagine instead of a new product that you're adding a feature to the product. All of those charts are going to be exactly the same. You're going to invest $7 million in a new feature, and that new feature is going to generate some additional revenue. If it's not generating additional revenue, your company probably wouldn't be invested. It might be harder to calculate those kinds of things, but conceptually, you can start talking about that the same way. This is the other thing that you can do when you're using this kind of survey model is start breaking down surveys. So start with an overall survey that talks about your whole product, but then break that down into surveys for individual features that may be a little bit more custom, or a number of companies are using surveys throughout the design and development lifecycle to test at many different points. We're putting together a chain like that right now where we will use some of the same metrics early on in the design process, but the metrics will also change depending upon whether you're doing different types of usability tests or concept tests, et cetera.
Got it.
That would be a great follow-up presentation.
Yeah.
On that. I think that's a whole another hour on that topic.
The next question is, you mentioned measuring employee efficiency instead of sales growth when building an internal product for employees. Do you have any recommendations for simple but effective ways to do this?
So I think this book that I mentioned earlier would be a good resource for that. If I remember correctly, there are a couple of scenarios in here where there are things like call centers, where the goal is to improve the efficiency of those call centers, and therefore reduce the costs to the company. You don't have to hire as many new people since call centers are constantly churning, and other things like that. That I think this would be a good resource for that question.
Cool. The next question is, in your experience, have you seen, what are some of the pros and cons of using SUS versus SuperQ to measure usability?
Yep. I'll point to Jeff Sorrow's work on this. I think everything that he's done in this space has been really effective, and I think I would agree with pretty much all the points that he makes here. I think it depends on what you're doing. SUS is 10 questions, whereas SuperQ, 2 of those questions are about, I think it was 87% of SUS. So you can get away, if the SuperQ questions work for you, you can actually measure 4 things in 8 questions instead of 1 thing in 10 questions. But parts of SuperQ is really designed, a lot of SuperQ is designed for websites, in maybe consumer type facing websites. SUS is also kind of, I don't know if I wouldn't say consumer, but if you're working in, for example, a B2B application, both of those will have limitations and maybe not fit quite as well as you might like them to fit, in terms of if your customers are potentially more focused on their performance than maybe they are focused on the interface itself. The look and feel of the interface, the weightings of these things might be a little bit different. I think every company is going to find a different set of quality in that space that's going to work really well for you. And the best way to get there is to try a few of them, just like Jeff Soro has done, compare them and see which ones have the highest correlations and which ones make the most sense for your business strategy. Any other questions? I think I'm not hearing you, Jerry, if you're talking.
Nope, sorry, I went mute again. The next question here is around, have you ever tried to present this type of modeling to a company that's new to UX? And if so, how do they usually react?
No, I can't say that I've tried presenting this directly to a company that's completely new to user experience. I can imagine that this would be a mouthful. I think part of what I'm trying to do here is use the business terminology, use those terms from all those different frameworks. So if you're talking to people that have experience in any of these areas like finance, decision models, marketing, analytics, hopefully you will be able to speak to them on some of their own terminology and some of their own techniques. But that would be interesting to see how a company that's never used UX would react to this. If anyone does have those kinds of experiences, please mention them in the chat, or also please feel free to send me an email. I'll display my email on the closing slide at the bottom.
Got it. The next question here is, let's see. So someone is curious, do you think that this financial modeling really seems to fit more of large upfront investments in projects? Have you adapted this for more agile projects where, for instance, there's continuous product development, or there's lots of changes and releases that are regularly happening?
I don't, depending upon your company, I don't know that there's as big of a gap between those two as it might seem like. I can say for Athena anyway, we follow an agile methodology, and we're constantly iterating. However, we do have big product releases, and we want to tie together, essentially use this model, these kinds of models in the second method to model the business as a whole, but then basically kind of start tying our whole usability process together to essentially to be able to measure the different processes, new features that are coming out, and have a good prediction before they come out of whether they'll move the needle. And then also sort of break this model down. Right now it's a little bit of a monolithic model, but you can take it one step further and start asking individual questions about if we make this change, or what kinds of changes customers might make based upon what they're saying in surveys or what they're saying in different places, to start estimating what changes will have the most leverage. And that is actually a strategic change in what your business might do, rather than a tactical change for an individual project. But you can take it a couple different ways there.
Got it. And let's see. I think, let's see here. I think that covers most of the, that covers all of the questions here, actually. So thank you, everybody, for coming with such great questions. And Erin, thank you again for presenting such a detailed view into ROI modeling. I think a lot of folks really appreciated the level of insight that you offered here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your great questions. Feel free to, again, send me an email if you have any other questions or try this yourself. I'd be very interested in hearing your experiences. All right, thanks.
Great. All right. Take care, everybody. We have one more session that is with Russ Unger, who's going to be talking about design leadership. So I will see you folks there at 2 p.m. for that session. Otherwise, take care, everybody.